especially historical trails, have this sort of way of creating cultural memory, or when people follow historic trails, whether it's like the Lewis and Clark Trail or the Camino Real, they're sort of doing it, they're going through the footsteps of an ideational past and remembering and commemorating things as they go along, right? And so I'm kind of doing the same thing. I'm starting at the north, up in Sonoma, with the most recent mission, and going south, 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 and hitting the oldest ones when I get to San Diego. In the early 20th century, Californian Americans wanted to think about and remember the past in California as this sort of romanticized Spanish colonial thing because of a popular book called Ramona. And so they really wanted to sort of play up this whole like Spanish colonial thing, and this is sort of, once again, contributes to this total erasure of the just incredible linguistic and cultural diversity that was going on in California prior to Spanish colonization. And so this Camino Real is just a supply route that was the overland route for supplying this chain of missions going up to here, essentially. And those supply routes were just following old Indian routes. And so it's like the modern highways are sitting on top of the Camino Real, is sitting on top of old, Miwok and Ohlone trails. And in the reality of those trails is it was extremely difficult. This is really rugged terrain. It's hard to move things overland in California. And, like much like the Americans later did, the Spanish relied on the sea. They were supplying these missions with ships coming out of San Blas and Nayarit, and that's why this mission is here. It's in a port. It's easy to supply. It's easy to get those agricultural surpluses and ship them back to the metropolis in New Spain. The Spanish were moving in to Baja California with a complete sort of like, old world Neolithic package. They had, wheat and all of the attendant sort of like crop weeds associated with it. They had dairy cattle and then, the kinds of fodder that dairy cattle like to enjoy. So that agricultural system brought with it all these other plants, weeds and such, invasive species that preceded the Spanish. The Spanish California mission system was heavily dependent on ranchos that helped maintain agricultural production to support the missions. Analyses of adobe bricks from old sites like this, the ones predating the mission era, have shown 3 different invasive species appearing in adobe bricks prior to the onset of missionization. Later mission structures show additional invasive species, up to 15 different invasive species coming along with the Spanish cattle and other agricultural plants. All these missions are in places where there were large numbers of native people. If not outright villages, then they would rely on the system they called reducciones to go and round up little hamlets and villages and force everybody to live in one place near the mission where they could be converted and engage in it. It's effectively forced labor. There were presidios, basically military installations set up to control these populations of people and keep them working on the farm. And all of these farms were established up here in order to generate, ostensibly they were to feed the mission itself, but they generated huge surpluses that were then sort of exported back to New Spain. This is a place called Tom's Point on the coast of California on Tomales Bay. You can see the opening just over my shoulder here. Between 1776 and the 1830s, the Spanish colonists in this area established 6 missions, a fort, and 2 civilian towns in the greater San Francisco Bay Area. And the reason for this was to sort of establish a buffer against the Russian presence up at Fort Ross. This area in between the San Francisco Bay missions and Fort Ross served as a sort of refugium for Coast Miwok people who wanted to continue to live traditionally and avoid both the mission system or work for the Russians at Fort Ross. I'm in a place in the East Marin Peninsula called China Camp State Park. Over here is San Francisco Bay, so we're out on the west edge of the northern branch of San Francisco Bay. Analyses of mission records have shown that baptisms drastically dropped at Mission San Rafael and Mission San Francisco Solano during the spring, when Miwok people would come back to places like this in order to meet, engage in ceremonies, and harvest shellfish. And archaeological tests have shown shell mounds in all these places where people keep coming back year after year after year. The Spanish needed to establish an outpost to the north side of the bay in order to counter Russian influence and also make sure that they had access to a resource that was finite and very important to both the Russians and the Spanish Empire, and that was indigenous labor. So by establishing Mission San Rafael close to a place like China Camp State Park, where Coast Miwok people were already gathering on the Marin Peninsula to gather shellfish, they could plug into that native labor and deny that labor to the Russians to the north. The modern San Francisco Bay Area, hemmed in as it is by mountains, ocean, and almost endless freeways, makes it difficult to imagine how this place might have looked in the past. Series of autonomous villages belonging to the Ohlone and Coast Miwok scattered throughout this vast coastal plain surrounding San Francisco Bay. I'm sitting on the foothill of Mission Peak above Mission San Jose in Fremont, California. I'm sitting amidst a grove of oak trees. Now, oaks produce acorns, and acorns were a favored food of many of the coastal indigenous tribes from the Pomo on down. Right now we're in Ohlone territory. The mission of San Jose was established in 1797 because there was a large Ohlone village here. Now, this group of people was not centralized in any way and was made up of groups of 25 or more tribelets surrounding the San Francisco Bay. When these groups joined missions or were coerced onto missions, they were not allowed freedom of movement unless the Franciscan fathers offered them what was called paseo, and this was effectively a pass that allowed people to come to groves like this during the right season to collect acorns for food if the food on the mission was insufficient. This is not unlike the kinds of traditional areas along the coast where the Miwok were collecting shellfish for missions on the Marin Peninsula. So yeah, so the Camino Real, as it's constituted, is a sort of fictional memory for California, or it's a way of remembering California. You know, that's romanticized, idealized, and doesn't have a whole lot to do with the past.
ho, ho, hey, 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 hey.